Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the Roman Empire, one of those things that a lot of people know about already, but we're going to be going through some of the finer points today about the Roman Empire itself. Now, there's a couple things we have to kind of clarify right off the bat before we can get really into the Roman Empire, and that is to say that the empire, like in terms of land expansion, really started during the Roman Republic era. It wasn't until 27 BCE that Rome had an emperor. And so, for the purposes of today, and really in general, the word empire can mean two different things. There's really kind of two ways to define empire. One is a broad definition about geography and control and political control, and that is that an empire is a realm of various nations that is ruled under one supreme nation. Right, so a whole bunch of different kind of geographical territories, which should be ruled kind of by themselves, are instead under the control of one particular nation. A more narrow definition is a realm of various nations ruled specifically by an emperor. Not every empire has an emperor, right? But an emperor has an empire, so to speak. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about how Rome forms its geographical and political empire. We will later talk about kind of the culture of that empire in a different lecture. We will also talk about how emperors ruled Rome after the fall of the Roman Republic, and really how the Roman Republic didn't end immediately, but kind of like ebbed away. And pieces of the Republic lingered on and continued, even under the rule of emperors. So let's begin. We're going to begin by talking about Mare Nostrum. Mare Nostrum is a Latin phrase which means our sea. And particularly the sea that they're talking about, the Romans. They're talking about the Mediterranean Sea, of course. And during the Republican era, the era of the Roman Republic, Rome was already building an empire by controlling areas outside of the borders of Rome. This is the Roman Empire roughly in the 2nd century BCE, and you can see that Rome has the entire Italian peninsula plus Sicily plus the islands of Corsicana and Sardinia, and then the kind of the east coast of Spain. They will also start expanding into the Greek areas, into the Near East, modern day Turkey, into North Africa, and then eventually into all of Spain, and eventually even further than all of this. But they start laying claim to this Mediterranean area, and they did this very, very rapidly. The Roman Empire just exploded into existence over the course of really like a couple of hundred years. But the Romans weren't like Alexander the Great and the ancient Greeks or the Macedonians. Alexander the Great, from the offset, wanted to create a massive empire. He was ambitious and power-hungry in a lot of ways. Instead, modern historians look at Rome as one of many militaristic societies that kind of dotted the Mediterranean Sea. So their success wasn't that they were the dominant force in the way that, Alexander the Great was, or that they had this grand vision the way that Alexander the Great did. But Rome's success in building an empire stemmed from different things. One of their successes, which you will hear repeatedly throughout this lecture, is that they incorporated conquered peoples as citizens. Like, rather than kind of conquering somebody and just putting the boot on them, the Romans would conquer a group of people and then kind of bring them into the empire as equals in a lot of ways. And so what this did is that even though you defeat, militarily a group of people, that are not Roman, those people will still get citizenship, and that incurs a lot of loyalty. Like, people, even though they are being ruled by Rome, they are loyal to Rome in a lot of ways because they are more or less treated like equals. And so, over the course of time, the Romans begin to view the Mediterranean Sea as kind of their land, like their space, right? This is their sphere of influence, right? And that's what Mare Nostrum means, right? Our sea, right? This is our land, right? Even though it's not land, right? It's ocean or water, right? So this is the Roman way of saying this is our territory, right? We kind of claim the Mediterranean as our own. So some of the early wars that the Romans are going to fight are actually not, like, the Greeks kind of fought each other for a lot of their conquests, and then eventually will expand outwards. The Romans, though, because of their geographical impulse, like their geography, right, the mountains and the way that the mountain ranges kind of force them to look west rather than east. So Rome's expansion is actually going to go west, whereas the Greeks kind of went east at first. So the Romans are going to expand south into northern Africa and then west into eventually Spain. But when they start expanding, the Romans are going to run into other great powers, particularly the city of Carthage. Carthage was an old city. It had been founded by the Phoenicians in the 8th century BCE, so it had been around for quite some time. It was a large city, very well populated, and there's going to be a series of wars between Rome and Carthage that become known as the Punic Wars. The word Punic is a Greek word that basically means the Phoenician cultures. Now, we didn't really talk about the Phoenicians in this class. They were an earlier civilization than even the Greeks, and so we just didn't, because of the way we've structured this class, we didn't really spend a lot of time talking about them. But the Greeks knew who they were and called them kind of the Punic culture, or referred to them as that. But the Carthaginians are essentially the same thing. Punic and Carthage relatively mean the same thing here. Carthage is located in northern Africa. It is right here. If you're looking at a modern map, you would see the city of Tunis right there, which is the capital of Tunisia. And you can even, Carthage in the modern day is kind of like a suburb of Tunis, and you can still go to Carthage and see ruins and people still kind of living in that general area. Carthage, though, was a very wealthy city because its location was fantastic for making money. Carthage is right here on the Mediterranean Ocean. They have easy access to the water, and if you were a trader, if you were somebody who was using the water to trade goods, you had to pass through this little strait right here in between Sicily and the kind of Carthaginian area. And so Carthage had a lot of control over this little segment of the Mediterranean Sea. And so they were able to control trade, make money. They had lots of wealth. They had a big navy, and so they were a real threat to the Roman Empire in a way. They were definitely competition at the very least. And at first, Rome, of course, being up here, Rome had made treaties with the Carthaginians. They worked together. Sometimes they even fought wars together. But gradually, this alliance between Rome and Carthage is going to sour. Rome is growing bigger and bigger and more powerful, threatening Carthage's space in the Mediterranean. But more importantly, as Rome expands down into this like southern Italian peninsula right here, and particularly into Sicily, they start taking over Greek city-states. And the Greeks really didn't like the Carthaginians. There was a lot of competition between the Greeks who lived here in Sicily and the Greeks who lived down here in kind of the southern part of the Italian peninsula, and the Carthaginians over the Mediterranean. So the Greeks very much viewed Carthage as a threat, and because Rome was a descendant, so to speak, of that Hellenistic culture, they also assume those fears and threats that they believe the Carthaginians pose. Over time, Rome comes to view Carthage as a competitor and eventually as a threat to Roman influence, and there will be a series of wars known as the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage. They are simply named the First, the Second, and the Third Punic Wars. And I'll show you the years here. This is the years of the wars. Basically, 3 major wars fought over a period of roughly 100 years. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about the second one, but the First Punic War goes from 264 to 241 BCE. Effectively, what happened in that Punic War is Romans kind of pushed Carthage out of this area right here, this Sicilian area right here. So the Greeks kind of had this eastern bit of Sicily, but the Carthaginians controlled this western portion. And after the First Punic War, the Romans took over that whole Sicilian area, which effectively became kind of their first colony, so to speak. Their first province that was kind of outside of the traditional Roman area. They signed a peace treaty ending the First Punic War. But it, of course, is not going to last very long, because both Rome and Carthage believed they should control the Mediterranean. Oftentimes the wars, particularly during this time period, and even today, come from different visions for what the world should look like and who should dominate a part of the globe. Right? You can boil a lot of wars down, not all of them, but many, down to who should influence what area and why. And in this case, it's Rome and Carthage arguing that this is Mare Nostrum, right? This is our sea. Carthage believed that too. The Second Punic War is a really, really interesting war because it involves this guy, who some of you have probably heard of because of the television show, which is not related to him, but this is Hannibal. Hannibal was a general from Carthage. He was not Roman, he was Carthaginian. And the Second Punic War that he's involved in starts when there's kind of a series of conflicts between Rome and Carthage in Spain. So in Spain, Carthage was there, Rome was also, the Roman military was also there, and there had been a series of conflicts over a particular city called Saguntum in Spain. Hannibal is a political leader in Carthage. He had fought, his father was a famous military commander from the First Punic War, and Hannibal was excited to kind of follow his father's footsteps and wanted to be involved in the Second Punic War, and so he begged and begged his dad to be able to go. And his dad made him promise. He made Hannibal swear that he would never befriend the Romans. And so this is kind of like this legendary story of Hannibal, swearing that he would never give an inch to the Romans. Hannibal is one of those great military leaders of world history, right? One of those guys that, even to this day, some of his tactics are still studied. He's just widely seen as one of those great military commanders of the ancient world. And so why is Hannibal well known in the ancient world? And so if you look, so this is a bust of Hannibal, a sculpture showing his face. But on the right, these are Carthaginian coins. And coins are actually a really interesting thing because they will show you a lot of things about a society. In this case, you see what is most likely Hannibal's face on a Carthaginian coin, and on the flip side of that coin is an elephant. Of course, elephants exist in Africa, but why is there an elephant on the Carthaginian coin? And how does this relate to Hannibal? Well, it relates to Hannibal because in his campaign, when Hannibal is not just going to fight the Romans in Spain, but he wants to actually invade Italy itself. And he does so by taking this crazy journey, going from Spain all the way up through what is modern-day France, into what I think would be modern-day Switzerland, and then down into Italy itself. I can actually show you a map of it right here. So he starts right here at Saguntum in eastern Spain, and he's going to take his troops, which he had 38,000 foot soldiers, about 8,000 cavalry, people on horses, and then 38 actual elephants. 38 what they called war elephants from Africa. They had got them over into Spain, and they were going to march those dudes on this crazy journey. Now the thing is, this is a really, really difficult journey to take because there's a mountain range right here called the Pyrenees that kind of divides Spain and France. Very dangerous to go through, but even more dangerous was this region right here, which is the Alps mountain range. The Alps are very tall mountains. They are prone to having heavy snows. So this was a very treacherous journey to go on. Not to mention, you're passing through territory that is really run by the Gauls. And they didn't take kindly to people coming into their territory unannounced. So not only is Hannibal marching all these dudes through dangerous terrain, but he's also doing so in enemy territory. So incredibly dangerous. And so the journey of Hannibal and his men marching through the Alps with these war elephants has become a legendary story for scholars of ancient history. One of the interesting things is you may be wondering, how do we know, right? How do we know this stuff, right? This is one of those questions that I get sometimes from students. How do we know that that's the path he took? What sort of evidence is there? And actually so Roman scholars, for example, contemporaries, people from this time period, wrote about Hannibal's invasion. like people like Livy and others, the historians of this era wrote about it. But the problem is that they weren't always reliable, right? Some of these historians cared more about telling a good story than they did about getting the actual facts and figures right. And so when you read old history from the people in the ancient Roman times, you kind of have to be a little bit skeptical. Like, are these people telling the truth? Is this really how it went down? But in the modern day, we still are able to find pieces of evidence about what happened. For example, there was a big debate about how far into the Alps Hannibal actually went. And one of the ways that we actually know the path that Hannibal took is actually through coins, oddly enough. They were able to trace part of the path by following dropped coins, dropped pieces of equipment, and able to trace Hannibal's path in this way, by finding these pieces of material. So like archaeologists, anthropologists, people who study ancient civilizations, were able to literally follow the material. There is a whole field, and this might sound incredibly boring to you guys, but I think this is so fascinating. There's a whole field of study called numismatics, and numismatics is about the study of coinage to tell us about ancient civilizations. You can tell a great deal about a group of people based on what they put on their money, right? Think about the United States. We have pictures of former presidents on there, and the people who are on those coins are generally seen as some of the best presidents, or at least the most influential people who ever existed in American history. Think about the dollars that we have. The $1 bill, George Washington. The $2 bill, which is really not in circulation anymore, is Thomas Jefferson. And then you got Lincoln, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, Ulysses S. Grant. These are massive figures in American history. In coinage, right? FDR is on a coin. John F. Kennedy is on a coin. These are just incredibly important people. Not to mention you got pictures of eagles. You got the Jefferson, the Lincoln Memorial, right? So there's all these symbols of American greatness on the coins, right? Well, the Carthaginians and other civilizations did the exact same thing. Right? They would put pictures of their famed military leaders on there, or their politicians, or their emperors, and what they were linked to. And so in this case, right, it's Hannibal and the elephant. But so coins carry language and imagery, and they give you years, and so coins can actually really tell us a lot about an ancient society. And so in the Alps, they actually archaeologists found coins from the Punic civilization, which led researchers to believe that Hannibal actually went much deeper into the Alps than people thought might have been possible. But so Hannibal's invasion was actually quite effective. As you can see, he gets through the Alps with a large percentage of his force left intact, and makes his way down and goes all the way down to the southern part of the Italian boot, goes to Rome, fights there. So Hannibal is in the Roman heartland, wreaking havoc. He uses guerrilla tactics, these hit and run tactics, because his military was incredibly mobile. Even though there's elephants, which aren't exactly known for being mobile, elephants can run actually quite fast despite their size. He wins numerous battles, and worst of all for the Romans, he convinces some of these outlying city-states that were allied with the Romans to actually turn against them. So things are going really bad in this Second Punic War for Rome. But of course, Rome is going to fight back. They send this guy named Scipio Africanus. I don't have a picture of him, unfortunately, but his name is Publius Scipio, which is right here in the middle of the screen, otherwise known as Scipio Africanus. I think Africanus because he fought in Africa, although I could be wrong on that. They first sent him to conquer Spain and basically kick Carthage out of Spain. Then Scipio Africanus is going to go from Spain into the Carthaginian area itself, ultimately setting his eyes on attacking the city of Carthage. When Scipio's troops arrive and are laying siege to Carthage, Hannibal has to come back. So you can see Hannibal actually kind of comes. He has to leave Rome and come down to this southern area so that he can invade upwards and try to defeat Scipio. Ultimately, the Scipio defeats Hannibal at this very famous battle called the Battle of Zama. Hannibal uses his war elephants, but Scipio had this great idea. He used these really, really loud trumpets, essentially, these really loud horns. Had all these people blow these horns at the same time to scare the elephants, and it actually worked. Some of the elephants, kicked their riders off and then stampeded through the Carthaginian lines, and it created all these basic chaos in the Carthaginian army. Scipio and his men were able to win that battle. And again, a peace treaty was signed, ending the Second Punic War. So the Romans are 2 for 2. The Third Punic War happens 50 years later. Again, it's over border squabbles, right? People disagreeing over, where the border should be, who should have influence in what area. And again, it's Carthage versus Rome. And this time, the Romans go straight to Carthage and lay down a 3-year siege. They basically cut Carthage off from its food and water supplies for 3 years, ultimately starving the people out. And at the end of the Third Punic War, Rome destroys Carthage. They're like, third time's the charm, we're done with you people. And they literally destroy the city. And as legends say, this is one of those things that is might have some truth to it, but also is probably a little bit legend, myth, is that Scipio Aemilianus, who was the general fighting in this war, he was the son or the grandson of Scipio Africanus. He had, after Carthage was destroyed, he had the fields of Carthage plowed up and then sowed, not with seeds to grow crops, but with salt. So he literally sowed the fields with salt, and basically, which would kill the ground. It would kill the soil for years and prevent crops from growing. Right, so this was Rome's way of saying, not only are you beaten and we're going to burn your city to the ground, but you will never be able to build here again. Like, we are going to destroy your livelihoods. Basically, the Third Punic War ends Carthage's power permanently and allows Rome to take over much of the Mediterranean Sea. Right after that, so you can see Carthage is right here. Right after conquering Carthage, they swing to the west and conquer much of the rest of Spain. And so now, after the Punic Wars, Rome controls a great extent of the Mediterranean. And by the time we get to the era of Roman emperors, right, because the Punic Wars happened actually during the Republic era, but by the time we get to Roman emperors, the Mediterranean is really Mare Nostrum, right? It really is the Roman Sea, so to speak. Let's talk about the emperors, because the last lecture we kind of ended that lecture with the death of Julius Caesar and the rise of Octavian. This is Octavian on your screen here. You may remember in the last lecture that when Octavian took power and he defeated his opponents, the Senate bestowed upon him the title of Augustus, which meant the revered one. And this, by historians, is seen as the end of the Roman Republic and now the beginning of imperial Rome, when Rome will be ruled by a series of emperors rather than the Senate. Now, let's talk about how this transformation occurs. How does a society that was used to democracy, that was used to this republican form of government, that was used to having a Senate, that the plebeians had fought for, their own voice, how is this society going to give up all of that power to an emperor? So Augustus slowly accumulates power. He doesn't just come in one day and be like, well, this is all mine, see you guys later, like y'all don't have any power anymore. Augustus slowly accumulates power. He kind of gradually brings it into himself. And he was helped by other politicians. There were senators, military leaders, aristocrats who kind of wanted to remain in the game. They wanted to maintain a hold on power, and if that meant working with Caesar Augustus, they were okay with that. So the way that Caesar Augustus does this is he kind of goes through the democratic channels. He slowly accumulates that power by getting elected to various positions. So at first he's elected to consul, one of the 2 consuls of Rome, people with great power. Then the Senate gives him the power of a tribune, which is, again, a very powerful position. So 2 different positions. One was elected, one was appointed. He gains more power each time he gets a new position. Then he declares himself to be the Pontifex Maximus, which means the high priest in Rome. Right? So he says that he's the Pontifex Maximus. And what he essentially has done here, when he declares himself to be the high priest of Rome, he combines the role of political leadership and church leadership. So literally kind of combining church and state together. And what starts to occur is that this doesn't happen with Augustus, but future emperors will literally declare themselves to be gods, right? They will literally see themselves as gods, and Augustus kind of encourages this to happen. There's this whole cult that pops up under Augustus's reign called Roma et Augustus, and basically that means Roman Augustus, essentially. And this cult argued that Augustus, the emperor, he wasn't called the emperor yet, but they argued that Augustus is basically the protector of Rome. People started building temples to Augustus, and future emperors would encourage this activity too. And so what's happening here is that there's this increased devotion, not to the Roman leader, but to specifically the emperor himself. Right? So it's not necessarily just a devotion to the ideals of Rome, but to a specific leader, right? Augustus is like, don't just be loyal to the emperor, be loyal to me, right? And in fact, we see this in the way that Augustus is depicted, often in statues. The statue on the left, for example, is a great statue for just amazing ability of sculpture here. But the way that Augustus is depicted is very, very important. He is depicted as a leader of the military, meaning he has been given the title of imperator, which will be the later word for emperor. He has this very ornate breastplate, this protective armor, and you can't really see it here, but if you get a picture of this statue and zoom in on the breastplate, what you'll see is a whole bunch of different types of people, and this is a symbol of all the people that have been conquered under Augustus's reign. And so basically saying like he is the ruler of all these different types of people. He is also depicted as barefoot in this image, which is important because that is how gods and heroes were depicted in ancient Greece and in Rome. And so there's this, what they're doing is they're equating Augustus with gods and heroes. That's a powerful visual image for Romans to view their own emperor as a god would be depicted. Okay, later on, the Senate would declare that Augustus was what they called the Princeps Civitatis, which means the first citizen of the state. So, what's interesting about the title Princeps Civitatis, this first citizen, is that this was a title that had been around for some time, just like the title of consul, the title of tribune. Princeps Civitatis had been around for quite some time, and so using this title didn't really alarm any of the Romans, right? They're just like, oh, okay, well, we've had other ones of those before. That's no big deal. But this is how Augustus accumulated power, is that he would use and increase the power of positions that Romans were already used to existing, right? As consul, as tribune, as the Princeps Civitatis. He's gathering all of this power, but since he's doing so through positions that were pre-existing, Romans didn't alarm anybody. Romans were like, yeah, that's okay. He's just another politician. He never used the word king, for example. That's an important distinction, because if he had declared himself to be king, that might have sent some alarm bells off, right? People would have been like, I remember the Etruscans, right? I remember how bad they were. We don't want them around anymore. And so Augustus didn't want to break with traditions because he didn't want to alarm anybody, but slowly over time, he's gathering power. Also, Princeps Civitatis is the root word for our modern word of prince, right? So in a way, Augustus, right, like setting that foundation for the word prince, and of course, a prince is a person with, full executive authority, usually the son of a king. Lastly, Augustus did get named Imperator of Rome, which is how you see him depicted here. The Imperator was a guy with basically executive military power. Imperator is derived from the word imperium, which means the power to command. So this is a sole individual with the power to command an army, similar in some ways to the presidency of the United States, who is considered the commander-in-chief. He's the head of all military branches. He's essentially seen as the leader of the military, and so was Augustus. And Augustus's power flowed from being a military commander. That was how he gained his authority and how he established himself as a leader. As imperator, Augustus could declare war. He could determine soldiers' wages, which of course determines how loyal your soldiers are. He could control their deployment, so where soldiers were fighting or not fighting. He built upon reforms by previous leaders like Julius Caesar to create a professional army. And this professional army has been shown in so many movies, like the movie Gladiator, pictured here, or other, like the TV show Spartacus. The Roman legion was a true professional army. These were professional soldiers. A legion was made up of about 5,000 troops. They usually were composed of Roman citizens. And these guys, when they signed up for the military, had lengthy terms. You had to be a soldier for about 20 years, but you received a salary. I believe you also had a retirement plan of some kind. They took care of their veterans after they were done fighting. In the early days, the Roman legion, if you survived your tenure as a legionnaire, you could gain land and be given kind of like a stipend later in life. So for some people, serving in the military was a jumping off point for a political career. And Augustus made the army loyal to him as a person, right, by controlling their deployment, by controlling their how much they got paid. And so Augustus created this army that was professional but loyal to him as the emperor. Not necessarily him as the head of the Roman state. Like he didn't say, oh, well, you guys need to be loyal to the emperor in general, but more so like you need to be loyal to me, Augustus. This is going to cause problems later on because Augustus was a good leader and the military men loved him. But what happens when you have a leader who's not very effective and not well liked? That dude's not going to have a good time. So Augustus would use this newfound military power as imperator to start conquering new territories. Under Augustus, they complete the conquest of Spain out here, and you can see so this is the extent of Augustus. When Augustus took power, this is the Roman Empire was in this yellow here, so all of this was already controlled by Rome by the time Augustus took power. And then over time, Augustus adds to that power, right? He conquers the green territories first, so this northern Africa region here, this like northern Spanish region here, this Turkish region over here. Then adds to it. He starts conquering the Balkans right here, what was back then called Dalmatia, eventually pushing all the way up into Germany, to the Germania region where the Germanic tribes lived. So through conquest, in a very similar way to Alexander the Great, Augustus is spreading Roman culture. There's this thing that it's very similar to like the Hellenism of the previous Greek empires. And Romanization is what starts to happen. Is everywhere that the Roman Empire goes, Romanization follows. The Roman culture, Roman language, Roman religion flows into these new regions, and to some degree influences the people who live there. Some people resist it more than others, because Rome is not as successful in northern Germany for a lot of years. They're going to be in Britain eventually, but again, for only a limited amount of time. So Romanization does spread throughout Europe, but to a limited degree. The other way that Augustus kind of accumulated power was by getting rid of popular assemblies, particularly the plebeian assemblies. He kept the Senate. So the Senate actually remains during Caesar Augustus's reign because he needed it for legitimacy, right? If he would have just come into power and just gotten rid of the Senate, people would have been like, what are you doing, right? That's crazy. And so by keeping the Senate around and instead kind of like bending the Senate to his will, Augustus is able to rule like an emperor while kind of keeping the appearances of democracy. By the end of his reign, Augustus had transformed Roman governance. Power had been consolidated in the hands of a very small elite, of which he, of course, was the head. There were probably like 10,000 or so government bureaucrats, nobles, senators, things like this, who owed their allegiance and their position to Augustus in some ways. So Augustus kind of built this loyalty throughout the Roman government to him, right? There were governors and senators and military leaders who supported Augustus's rule. After Augustus, we're going to enter this period of time that a historian at one point called the Pax Romana. The Pax Romana was roughly a 200-year period with relative stability in the Roman Empire. And what I mean by stability is political stability. There were, of course there's going to be bad leaders. Of course there's still going to be wars, particularly out in kind of like the frontiers of the Roman Empire. There's still conflict and death and famine. All of those things are still happening. But the Roman Empire during this Pax Romana was incredibly stable. It starts in 27 BCE with Augustus's ascension, right? That's when Augustus comes to power and kind of that's the beginning of the Imperial Roman era. And then it ends in 180 BCE, or I'm sorry, 180 CE, so we've passed the year 0 now, 180 CE with the death of Marcus Aurelius. During this Pax Romana, and again this is something we've already touched on, is that Rome was able to maintain stability by giving citizenship to conquered peoples. Right? Because if you just conquer a group of people and kind of keep your boot on their neck, they're going to keep rebelling. And so to prevent that, Rome would give citizenship, they would give certain privileges to conquered peoples and basically bring them into the Roman Empire. The Romans would even allow local laws to remain. So they would Rome would come in and be like, all right, you guys got to abide by Roman laws, but whatever sort of local stuff y'all were doing, you can keep doing that. That's fine. So Rome was able to kind of blend Roman culture with these other cultures that they were taking over, like the Germanic cultures or the Gauls or whomever. And it kind of incurred a little bit of loyalty, but most importantly, it helped keep things stable. And this is crucial because the Roman Empire, as we're going to see at the height of it, the Roman Empire is just absolutely massive. It covers, tons and tons of land, millions and millions of people, and the Roman military was only about 100,000 people. Their military wasn't that big. And so, you can't deploy the military everywhere. So you need that internal stability. And during this Pax Romana, there was a lot of that. They got people to buy into the idea of being Roman, right? Of being part of this Roman Empire. So basically, as long as people paid taxes, as long as people didn't rebel, as long as they, these various regions supplied soldiers for the army, they were free to do whatever they wanted. They were free to basically live their lives as if the Romans didn't exist in some ways. So Augustus is the he creates a dynastic lineage. Eventually, this lineage is called the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Right here, you can see that Augustus is the one who starts it. And Augustus did not have a son, so he didn't have an heir that he could kind of give power to like a king would. Right? Kings want to have sons because then the dynasty flows through that family line. Instead, what Augustus did was he groomed one of his nephews. He didn't have a son, so he chose a nephew to kind of take over when he died. And this then became the norm. Each new emperor would basically choose a family member that they thought would be the best person to take over after them. This became the norm. Augustus, eventually, he chose his nephew Tiberius and kind of groomed him to be the new emperor. And so over the years, Augustus kind of started sharing a lot of his power with his nephew Tiberius. And then when Augustus died, the Senate declared Tiberius to be the new emperor, to be the new princeps. Remember, like that first citizen. Augustus also created something called the Praetorian Guards, which is, you can see them right here in the sculpture. Basically, these were the bodyguards of the emperor. These were elite soldiers, elite bodyguards, chosen from, the military ranks. But, so their whole objective is to protect the emperor and thus protect Rome. But these guys also cause problems because sometimes they would get involved in politics. Like how these guys were loyal to Augustus because Augustus was a good leader. What happens when you get a bad one? All right, what happens when you get a bad leader? And what started happening is that the Praetorian Guards would kill them. So, for example, Augustus gives power to his nephew Tiberius, and Tiberius gives power eventually to, I believe, his nephew, his name was Caligula. Caligula was a nightmare of a person. He was very short-tempered, violent, cruel, just an awful person by all the old historian accounts. Which sometimes, again, we have to take these things into is it entirely true? But all across the board, people say Caligula was an awful leader, and because of this, his own guards assassinated him. That happened actually kind of regularly, is that if an emperor made bad decisions over and over again, or if he was just an awful person, or made the wrong enemies, sometimes the Praetorian Guard would just straight up just kill him. Or they would allow an assassination attempt or an assassination to happen. So, these are the big three dynasties during the Pax Romana, the Julio-Claudian, the Flavians, and the Nerva-Antonine dynasties. We are going to kind of skip down to this last one, the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, and talk about a couple of the famous leaders during this Pax Romana. One of them is named Hadrian. Hadrian ruled from 96 to 192 CE. He was one of the... So this Nerva-Antonine dynasty was well known because they had Niccolò Machiavelli, who was an Italian political philosopher. In fact, you will read Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince later this semester. Niccolò Machiavelli called Hadrian and some of his other emperors the Good Five Emperors, or the Five Good Emperors, because they provided a lot of stability. They were excellent statesmen. So in this Nerva-Antonine dynasty, Hadrian was one of these five good emperors alongside Nerva, Hadrian's predecessor Trajan, a guy named Antoninus Pius, and then Marcus Aurelius was the last of them. Each of these five good emperors were capable men. They were adopted by their successor. They provided incredible stability during this era. They were all military leaders, capable administrators. So these were all good leaders. And Hadrian is an excellent case study of what it took to be a good emperor. He was well educated. He was an admirer of Greek culture. And during his youth, he caught the attention of his cousin Trajan. Trajan was the emperor of Rome. And so and kind of following in the Augustus footsteps, Trajan started grooming Hadrian to be the next emperor. And over time, Trajan gets Hadrian in the military forces and kind of gets Hadrian started on a political career. Eventually, Hadrian will become one of Trajan's close advisors. Hadrian will be deployed to the borders to help kind of secure Rome's borders with the military. And so basically over the course of his life, Hadrian is being educated on how to run and how to defend an empire. So when Trajan dies in 117 AD, power passes to Hadrian. This is 117 AD. This is the largest the Roman Empire ever gets. So when Hadrian takes over, the Roman Empire is at its largest extent. It is the biggest that it will ever get. It's huge. You can see that they have taken over large areas of North Africa. They've pushed, very far into what they called the Near East. They've taken over all of the Germanic areas except for this northern Germany area over here, all of Spain and France, and then even pushed into what they called Britannia, or what would be modern day England. And so he's got to defend and administrate this whole thing. That's a big task for one dude. But Hadrian was brilliant. He was a brilliant administrator. And the way that he did this was he created formal administrative departments. So basically he created an imperial bureaucracy. The people who would see the day-to-day running of the empire, right? You appoint governors over certain areas, and you create administrative assistants and departments to help them run that area. And then you just do that everywhere to create kind of like this support structure for the empire. He also created the civil service, which was separate from the military service. So you'd have guys that were in the military. And the thing is, a lot of Romans were expected to be in the military, but what if you're the kind of person who doesn't want to kill people or doesn't have the talent for military service and doesn't really, that's not where your heart is? Well, those types of people could go into the civil service and start working as state administrators. So they're still helping the Roman state. They're just not in the military. And so Hadrian essentially allowed for the more efficient running of an empire. And Hadrian, to kind of illustrate the strength of the Roman Empire under Hadrian commissions a number of massive building projects, very similar to what the Greeks did. You show your might as a civilization by building stuff, by doing things. And so a couple of good examples. One is Hadrian's Wall. Now I'll show you the wall here in a second, but if you look up here in this upper left part of your map, you can see that there's this like sharp line that cuts off the top edge of Britannia. That's where Hadrian's Wall is. It's the northernmost limit of the Roman Empire. So they conquered all of Britannia, but there was these people up here in the northern part of Britannia known as the Britons, and they were fierce and they were difficult to conquer. So essentially what Hadrian did was he built a massive wall right here to cut them off. And so if you're looking at a map of what is modern-day England, Hadrian's Wall cuts across right here. And this is what the wall looked like originally. It was quite large. It had these turrets, these watchtowers. It was supposedly 10, 20 feet tall. And not only was it a defensive strategy, but it was also a symbol of Roman power, of Roman control over this region. You can actually still go today and see the remnants of Hadrian's Wall. This is actually Hadrian's Wall today in the center part of England. You can actually go and visit this. I did not take this picture, but you can go take tours of Hadrian's Wall and check it out, which I think would be really cool. Another thing that Hadrian built much closer to home, meaning home as in Rome, he built the Pantheon in the center of Rome. I believe I can't remember exactly. There was someone else who had started building it, and I think he finished it. My history's a little hazy on that. But the Pantheon is one of the most well-kept, best preserved Roman temples anywhere in the Roman Empire. Probably because it's been used over and over throughout the years, right? It was a Roman temple that then became like a cathedral and all sorts of other things. And so it's been used. Now it's kind of like a tourist destination more than anything. And so if you go inside this massive building right here, there's a dome at the top of this. And at the top of the dome, there's an opening that I believe is called the oculus, and it shines light in, depending on the time of day. And it is, you'll see a little bit more about the Pantheon in another video, I believe, but it's just excellent condition, a testament to the might of Rome. The last emperor I want to talk about is the last member of the Nerva Antonine dynasty, and he's the second to last member of it, and he's the last of the 5 good emperors, and that's Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius, his rule was marked by numerous crises, problems. The Tiber River flooded in 162, destroying crops, killing animals. Famine occurred. Soldiers were returning from wars in the east, and they brought diseases back with them, particularly a disease known as the Antonine Plague that killed, untold thousands of Romans. He had to deal with Germanic tribes attacking from the north. And in fact, the problems on the northern border get so bad that Marcus Aurelius goes there himself, and he spends much of his later life as kind of like a barracks emperor, basically spending time in the military camps in the north, living with the soldiers and fighting these wars against the Germanic tribes. In fact, if you watch the beginning of the movie Gladiator, that is the one of the very beginning scenes is a fight with the Germanic tribes, and you actually see Marcus Aurelius as an elderly emperor, helping to fight these tribes. When he was out there, he actually wrote this book, Meditations, which was basically like his war diary. It was essentially his advice about doing one's duty, living in accordance with nature, and it became a classic of the Stoic philosophy. And so it provides good insight not only into Marcus Aurelius's kind of character and personality, but also gives us good insight into the how Greek culture has continued to influence the Romans even hundreds of years later. But here you can see all the Germanic tribes. Now, obviously, this is not in English here, but you can see all the different groups that existed in the northern part of the Roman kingdom. So Rome's empire stops like right down here. This is the Roman kingdom right down here, or the Roman Empire. And these are all Germanic tribes that would, at various points, invade Rome and cause problems. And the issue for Marcus Aurelius like basically lived up in this region fighting these groups. And so the problem for Marcus Aurelius is that when he dies, his chosen successor was a guy named Commodus. And Commodus was he's the antagonist in the movie Gladiator. Commodus was a delusional, dictatorial ruler. People didn't like him. He is killed in a plot. And after he's killed, numerous people try to claim the throne. And you can actually see this right here. Like eventually, a group called the Severan dynasty takes over. Septimus Severus is the first of this dynasty. But basically, Rome will go through this like series of emperors over the next 100 years or so. And in fact, in 235, when Severus Alexander is killed, Severus Alexander was killed because you don't need to know who he is, but it's a fascinating story because he basically there had been fighting with those northern Germanic tribes, and Severus Alexander figured, like, instead of fighting them, let's just make a peace treaty and leave them alone, and they'll leave us alone. And so he made this peace treaty with the Germanic tribes, but his soldiers were so angry because they'd spent years and blood and friends had died fighting these guys that they actually were so mad they actually killed Severus Alexander. So his own military soldiers and leaders killed him, and this led to what became known as the crisis of the 3rd century. Over the next 40 or 50 years, there's this 50-year period where Rome goes through a series of emperors just back to back to back to back. Over 20 people tried to claim the throne during this crisis of the 3rd century, many of whom were military leaders trying to like leverage their power as a military general into political power. Almost all of them died in civil wars or by assassination. And this obsession with claiming the throne, these military leaders constantly vying for power in Rome, left the frontiers unguarded. During this crisis of the 3rd century, we see a weakening of all of these frontier areas. And what starts happening then is non-Roman groups start to take advantage. Groups that live outside of Rome start to invade into the Roman area and start pillaging small Roman towns, start taking over or at least pushing back Rome's borders. And this turmoil affected Roman life too, life in actual Rome itself. The economy is going to take a downturn because people are constantly worrying about when the next war is going to come. Farmers are struggling to pay their taxes, and so if they couldn't pay them, they'd get kicked off their land, and so then they'd have to move to the city, and you'd have all these landless, poor people living in the city, which is a recipe for a problem. There was lots of corruption within the administrations of, especially when there's no emperor to kind of run the show. There was lots of corruption in the Roman government. And so over time, in a way, the Roman Empire kind of like had these disastrous consequences were the result of the long trajectory of the Roman Empire. After this procession of bad emperors, Rome is actually going to fall numerous times. Rome will be sacked and destroyed like 3 or 4 times over the course of a couple hundred years. And essentially the reason why is because the empire became a weight around Rome's neck. It was so big and unwieldy and impossible to govern. You've got one emperor in Rome trying to control this vast area out here. It basically just dragged Rome down in some ways. The Roman Empire was expansive, covered all this land, millions of people, so it's huge. It's expensive to maintain an empire like that because you're constantly paying for militaries to go out and fight in the, and on the borders or in the frontier. You're constantly trying to convince your allies to remain your allies. And so over time, Rome, the imperial Rome is going to fall apart. just because it is so difficult to keep an empire together. It's expensive. Rome's empire was massive, and there was a series of bad leadership that led to kind of the erosion of political stability in Rome. Now, Rome still had a good run, though, right? I mean, if you go all the way back to the Roman Republic, that's a 400, 500, really, if you're being generous, 600, 700 year run where Rome was the key power in the center of the Mediterranean, and its culture through Romanization is going to spread throughout Europe, particularly the areas around the Mediterranean Sea. And so we'll talk a little bit more about Romanization and the spread of culture and how that had influence well beyond just the Roman Empire. But that's a whole conversation for a different day. So thank you guys for watching. I'm glad that we could talk about the Roman Empire today, and I'll see you guys next time.